In the 1800s, when the world was a very different place, there was a time when white women did unimaginable things to black male slaves. Here are some of those acts. There were people of both sexes held in slavery, and some of those people had skin that was lighter than others. These people with light complexion, regardless of whether they were males or females, discovered that they were in a very dangerous position. Why? So let's break that down, shall we? Enslavers. A significant number of these slaveholders had the racist belief that their race was superior to others and claimed that they held this superiority because of the color of their skin. This sick worldview gave them a sense of authority that was fairly terrifying, and it empowered them to do terrible things. Now, what transpired after that is where things start to take a sinister turn. Several of these white ladies who were married to slave owners abused their position of control in various ways. In ways that are difficult to even put into words, they were able to take advantage of the men who were held in slavery, particularly those who had light complexion and were susceptible. Consider the fact that these guys were enslaved and had no actual voice in the decision-making process. Everyone in the home, including the ladies, was subject to the authority of those who held them in slavery. Some of these women chose to take advantage of their positions of power to have sexual encounters with the men. It was done against everyone's will. It was all about exercising power, exploiting others, and taking control. In addition, let's not overlook the art of seduction. There are documented cases in which white women successfully used their allure to seduce enslaved men into sexual relationships with them. It's a dark take on what most of us would understand to be a romantic relationship. These partnerships were frequently fraught with asymmetries of power and coercion on both sides. The bedroom was not the only place that felt the repercussions of all of this activity. Additionally, society was impacted. People talked amongst themselves, rumors disseminated, and people's lives were destroyed as a result. Relationships between people of different races, especially those involving white women and black males, were frowned upon and might result in a variety of complications. Interracial adultery and forbidden love. Imagine for a moment that it is the 1700s, a period of time when the world, and particularly the United States, was quite different. It was a difficult moment for everyone involved because slavery was in full force at the time. Nevertheless, despite the gloomy nature of this period in history, there were surprising sparks that flew across ethnic barriers. Imagine this: couples who are unhappy in their marriages. It is a reality, right? To put things into perspective, divorce was a common solution for unhappy couples in the past, just as it is now. But the revelations that were made throughout the divorce process are what really make this story stand out. There were rumors going about that some white ladies were having affairs with black guys, and people were spilling the tea about it. It's a scandal, isn't it? Complaints were being lodged left and right, most likely by white men whose wives had chosen partners with whom they did not share love interests. They were upset, and they had the impression that their marital domain was being invaded. Let's take a closer look at these illicit romantic encounters, shall we? Imagine unannounced meetings under the cover of the moon, with sweet nothings being whispered and stolen looks exchanged. There was more to it than just a physical appeal. There were genuine feelings involved in this situation. These romantic tales did not spring up out of nowhere overnight. They developed in secrecy, shielded from the watchful eyes of civilization as it progressed. The outcomes of these interactions were not pleasant in any way. Infamy in public, social exclusion, and even physical assault at times. The conventions of society about race were not prepared to be so brazenly challenged. Now, you may believe that this is all about love, but that is not the case at all. It's also about power dynamics and the rules of society. The pre-existing racial hierarchy was perceived to be in jeopardy as a result of these ties. The repercussions were not limited to one's own life. They sent shockwaves through entire towns and had a profound effect on the lives of individuals who were directly involved. Sexual abuse by white women. Imagine a world in which people who were supposed to look out for and care for others instead turned out to be their tormentors. This is a painful fact, but it's one that we can't avoid thinking about. Imagine the following: a plantation in the South where the unrelenting heat of the sun can be felt all day long. African men who are held as slaves toil away in the fields. Their bodies were drenched in sweat, and their spirits were crushed by the weight of the chains that bound them. But there is another factor at play here that is far more subversive, and that factor is white women. In the perspective of society, the exact embodiment of virtue and innocence were frequently the very people who caused suffering and abuse. Let's not put a positive spin on it. White women routinely engaged in sexually exploitative behavior toward enslaved black men and did so on a regular basis. We're talking about a whole host of horrifying things here, from sexual and physical abuse to coerced procreation and other forms of forced sexual activity. We are unable to turn away from the frightening and unsettling reality that is before us. The testimony found in historical records will send shivers down your spine. Documentation of these atrocities was compiled by the American Freedmen's Inquiry Commission. Men who were held as slaves revealed the horrible treatment they received at the hands of white women and came up about their experiences. These were not lone instances that occurred in a vacuum. They were a part of a pattern that was really unsettling. Imagine a world in which white women used their power and privilege over enslaved folks to coerce black males into sexual relationships. It is a jarring reminder that does not distinguish between males and females. When we discuss the atrocities of slavery, we must not overlook this harrowing period in our history. The darkness of the past is not the only thing that will be revealed in this chapter. It's important to recognize the resiliency of individuals who made it through the ordeal. White women slave owners and enslaved wet nurses. Let's take a more in-depth look at the events that actually transpired in the 1850s. Step forward historian Stephanie E. Jones Rogers, who thought it was high time to correct some of the misinformation that had been spread. She ripped the pages out of the old history books and discovered a long-lost secret. White women were not merely spectators during the whole process of slavery. Rather, they were active participants. You have to understand that for these women, it wasn't just about power or status, even though some of them did enjoy the rewards associated with those things. In addition to that, it was about icy, hard cash. Even at the most tumultuous periods of human history, money has been the driving force behind most of the major events. White girls were taught from a young age how to play the game of slave owning from the time they were very small. They took their fathers' and husbands' advice and, to use a figurative expression, learned the ropes. Slave ownership was considered a lucrative kind of investment during this time period, and these females had no intention of letting their male counterparts have all the fun. However, this is where things start to take an even more fascinating turn. Wet nursing was a unique role that was reserved for white women during the era of slave ownership. Wet nursing is essentially the same as breastfeeding a child who is not your own, despite the fact that the term wet nursing has a more sophisticated sound. And can you guess who usually got the job? Slave ladies of African descent. You might be wondering why black ladies. In the end, it was a confluence of biological factors and the erroneous assumptions held by society. It was common practice to encourage hiring black women for wet nursing jobs because to the perception that they possessed more caring traits. Therefore, white ladies would have these enslaved black women breastfeed their newborns while they themselves were responsible for the upbringing of their own children. What a peculiar turn of events in the dynamics of the family. The legacy of slavery exposed. It is the late 1800s, and at this point slavery can legally be considered a thing of the past. But wait on there, for the nation is still bearing the wounds from those hard times. One of the things that breaks your heart the most is the silent suffering of black people, especially black men who were victims of horrifying sexual abuse at the hands of white women. This is one of the most heartbreaking elements. Now step forward. Harriet Jacobs, a feisty black woman who had survived all that had been thrown at her. She comes to the conclusion that enough is enough and that she is going to reveal all in her slave tale. She brings to light the distorted truth about sexual assault that occurred during the time of slavery. This woman had the fortitude to speak up, and her story was a smack in the face to those who tried to hide this awful part of our past. However, here's the thing. Not every story was brought to the forefront. Those black male slaves who were forced to suffer in silence were not always given the opportunity to recount their stories. Their stories were hushed up and relegated to the obscure recesses of the annals of history. And that's not even quite fair, is it? A fast forward to the present day reveals that we are still addressing the fallout from all of that disaster. We can't just brush the history of slavery under the rug and pretend it never happened. It's like a specter that follows us around and keeps scaring us. But do you know what's even more terrible? When we fail to learn from the past, we are doomed to repeat it. Therefore, it is imperative that we do not forget and that we recognize the voices of those who were repressed in the past. Imagine if we were able to listen to all of those stories and all of those voices that have been kept quiet. We'd have a deeper comprehension of the torment and anguish that slavery inflicts upon its victims. It serves as a timely reminder that, although we've come a long way, we still have a long way to go before we can construct a society that is more inclusive and just. We hope you like this video, subscribe to the channel if you're a history addict, and please let us know about what civilization or time period we should talk about. Also, watch another video here.